There he is. I will share my screen. All right. Can I get a thumbs up that you see the PowerPoint? Okay, we're just getting set up. All right, welcome. It's good to see you all. It is a snowy day here in my neck of the woods, and I think it's probably going to happen across the state, it appears. I will go ahead and get us rolling. I'll go ahead with our preamble and to set the stage for us here. So our conversations on our topic with Public BEP, this is our school system leadership committee. They're not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the General Assembly. Public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly. Documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. All right. Thank you all again for serving, and welcome. I will pull our agenda forward and hand it over to Director Weeks.
Thank you, Janice, for getting us started. I don't know if the snow had us a little slow on our internet connection this morning or not here, but I hope you've had a good morning and been very positive. I thank you for your work up to this point. Janice, have we already called roll? Have you taken attendance this morning?
I have not.
Okay, doing that for us as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me pull up my list here. All right, so we have Dr. Weeks with us, Mark Florence. If you'll just say here for me, I'm going to roll through. Dr. Lilly.
Here.
Dr. Steve Barnett.
Here.
Chad Moorhead. Diane Elder. Rob Britt.
Here.
Dr. Dyer.
I am here.
Dr. Simcox.
Here.
John Barker.
Yes.
Paige Wally. And Representative Reagan.
Here.
Hi, thank you.
Janice, thank you for keeping us organized and for doing the work that you're doing. Ladies and gentlemen, we have had quite a bit of information to look at since our last meeting, and I know during the holidays, I know everyone's busy. I trust that you have taken that responsibility seriously and spent some time with the documents that we have seen. And so from our last meeting and the information that has been shared with us, as you know, the public feedback that has come in through the state has been shared and broken down for us. And Janice, I think in the next slide or two, there were maybe the 4 or 5 main points. Yes. Today we are to look at those final things and try to prioritize those is one of the things that we were asked to do. Looking at those recommendations that I guess summarized everything that came in state comments and trying to prioritize that for us as school leadership committee and making decisions about those. One of the most encouraging things I've heard from the commissioner right after her meeting with the governor was that everything that is currently included in the BEP formula was to be included in the new funding formula as well. So I think that, just as a director of schools, that was very encouraging that we would not have to go individually one by one through that list to make sure all of those items were included or not included again. So I think that will expedite a lot of our time. And I think last time we spent some time going through many of those items that were currently in the BEP formula, but I think there is that commitment from the State Department to keep those things in there so that we don't have to go back and reemphasize those one by one again. And so today we are to look at those things that have been provided to us. And again, if we have something as a school leadership committee that we want to add to that list, we can certainly do that. Next time we meet, again, we'll review those documents and talk about the weighting a little bit more. We do want to talk about the weighting that we have discussed and look at that as comparison to the other weights that have been brought up and been shared with us. And again, today, trying to prioritize those and make some decisions on those. My understanding in meetings 5 and 6, we're actually supposed to discuss any policy recommendations that go around those. And I know we have talked about, what does it mean to be a rural district? What does a sparse district mean? What does it mean if we're in an urban district and an urban cost of living district? And so those are some of the things that have come up in our committee that we will continue to think about definitions. And so I would encourage you, I hate to say homework, but as planning for those next 2 upcoming meetings, the timeline that we'll be going through will be kind of quick because again, as the legislature comes into town and starts getting to work, I know the commissioners asked that we have these materials ready to go to the total committee that will be looking at the information that we have. So today, I'd really like for us to look at those based priorities and see what we feel are essential to be included in there, and to make some prioritization on those. And again, thank you, Janice, for that slide there. The must-haves, the should-haves, the nice-to-haves, and the long shot, if you will. What could be included, but is probably not going to be. So our first slide, I think. Let's go one past that, Janice, where we actually look at, these are the things that have currently shown up in almost, in some form or another, I would say, in almost everything that has come about in terms of public feedback. And I would say these also came, I think some of these came from BEP committee, BEP study committee. Michelle, I know you serve on that. And again, we're not necessarily looking just from that BEP standpoint, but these are some of the things that through study, through review of those materials, have appeared in almost every group, every subcommittee in some form or another. And I just wanted to make sure that we are on board with these 5 or 6 items and see if there's anything that you saw that is really not contained in one of these areas or another. And so looking at those nurses, and again, we had some discussion at our last meeting, in meeting 3, does every building need a nurse, or is there a recommendation for some ratio that buildings needs a nurse? School-based support, so that would be counselors, psychologists. I think we use social workers in there. That came out from the notes that I had from our last meeting. The social worker, counselor, school psychologist. Making sure teacher salaries and benefits are competitive and attractive, and doing what we need to do. We talked a lot about technology and the technology for devices, the technology for the connectivity, the technology for new textbook technology that's used in different things of that nature. And then again, I think that last one, just, as we talked about here, I may not need an SRO in every building, and some schools may need 2 SROs. And I think back to that discussion we had right before Christmas. We were talking about, every school may not need one of those, but it was based on that community needs assessment. And I think in the last conversation I had with the commissioner, there was an idea that we might have a pot of money that would maybe to cover some of these things in terms of direct spending or direct funding that would come straight for things like an SRO or a nurse, if we wanted to make such recommendations. Maybe we don't think that every school truly deserves an SRO because of the size or because of the structure of the school. I think we had some conversation around some multi-building campuses where maybe one SRO could cover the entire campus. And so I think those would be the things that we would look at from that standpoint of, would there be a pot of money that we could recommend the size of that pot of money, percentage basis or a total basis, where school districts could make their selections based on those individual needs of districts. So looking at the list, those 5 or 6 items there, do you see anything there from your study, from your review of the materials, from your recollection of our conversations, or just something that you see that is not included in that base amount that every student should generate one of those supports? Is there something from your work or your studies, your homework that you've seen that would not be included here that we want to make sure is included as our group?
Danny, the flexibility part there, that is so wide open. It's a little hard for me to interpret what all that might include, like behavior specialists. Might that include that? I saw in one of the comments like dyslexia screening is something that we're required to do. Is that something that should be funding for that? Should that be included in the base? How about money for facilities? I guess my personal philosophy is there's so much that we need that it's difficult to really just say it's only these items. I guess where I'm coming from, I would like to see the base just as large as possible, because we're all going to have these needs. We're all going to have facility needs, and so I don't know what we need to do as a committee to kind of go in that direction. And other people may feel differently, but that's kind of where I'm landing on it.
Oh, Gary, I'm right there with you. I think the issue of facilities absolutely has to be baked into the base. I know that we have some money that comes from the county commission on a fairly regular basis, although it's not nearly as much as we would like, and we're going to have to put some pressure on them about that. But I think the question that we would have is, base means base, and that would be something for everybody to have. So, again, not to go back to the old idea of thinking about BEP, but to that point about flexibility, I think to Gary's point, just to reiterate everybody, I would say that our conversations here have been exactly that build that base as broad and as supportive as possible, because with that constitutional requirement that comes in our state constitution, as others as well, that there's kind of that understanding that there are some things that should be funded. And I think facilities would be one of them. I think what I would also say, though, is in our review, what we've talked a little bit about is with that teacher salary and benefits, to go back to the notion and think about what the class size is that's determining that. And I think there have been some interesting studies and discussions throughout the years, and then discussions here with us at in Shelby County Schools, about what that class size should look like and whether we should actually program for and build into this new funding model some new ratios. So the notion of the STAR study from way back when, just really does come back to the notion that the 1 to 20 in early grades, K1, 2, 3, may not necessarily be the most effective as far as getting outcomes for our students. So I think what I would just encourage us to do is think about maybe, that there's some guiding issues that might be in there, and relative to the class size ratio for us, especially in the lower grades, to take that down to a 1 to 15 as part of the base.
And Danny, something I would add too, we talked about this morning in the academic engagement group, is pre-K. That's something that's not on this list, and something that I personally feel is very important that we think through too. So that's something that I think somewhere in this discussion needs to be part of what we're looking at, is how can we fund pre-K across the state for all people who are interested in that.
Okay.
For those of you that don't have the view there, this is Representative Reagan. I'm going to have to step in here and from the standpoint of watching taxpayer dollars, we need, if we're going to say that, we need a measure that justifies the benefits of pre-K, justifies the ratios. I personally did a statistical study about 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, I'm sorry, on the class size and a statistically based model of class size and its interaction. By itself, as a factor, class size was not a significant factor statistically. And I did have a statistical interaction with some other factors that I studied. And that statistical interaction was, in fact, the biggest interaction was urban versus rural. And from the standpoint of taxpayer dollars going to this, I don't think we can sit down and say conclusively that 1 to 15, 1 to 20, 1 to 30, or whatever number you come up with is going to be the right answer across all 140 plus school districts we have in the state. And so rather than saying this is a hard number, a hard ratio that we have to take into account, I would much prefer to say that we have a performance-based measure that drives that. That is to say, the student outcomes are better when we have this ratio versus that ratio in this circumstance versus that one. A higher student-teacher ratio may be perfectly acceptable in a rural setting and not in an urban one. But just if we say in the BEP, it's got to be this, we are, in my mind, not doing our due diligence to our population that's providing that money.
So Representative Reagan, just a quick question. And, you know, anytime you and I start talking about research, it's going to be a good, fun conversation. And I'd love to talk to you next time I'm in Nashville and you're in session. I look forward to sitting down. The question there, though, is, you know, would you, encourage that kind of flexing? Would there be kind of a range that would be possible? Because, you know, for us, thinking about how we would take that class size ratio down, and as to your point about the urban environment, that, you know, especially with the smaller class size, it benefits those urban students. But how do you and we wouldn't necessarily need to get into technicalities here, but how would you necessarily structure that in a funding formula that would allow some of that maybe flexibility?
Well, you're going to have to establish some measures. Now, right now, we have the ACT scores, which, and by the way, everybody knows that there is a suite of ACT tests that we could use. We also have TN ready testing, and we have testing at the end of the 3rd grade for literacy and numeracy. We have testing at the end of the 8th grade. My point is that there are measures out there that if we can agree, now that's an operative phrase, that we have to come up with operational agreements that these particular measures, whatever we're going to use, are going to be those across the board. They apply everywhere that we're looking in every school district, whether it's Mountain City or Memphis, that the same measures are valid. And then that performance measure then will determine whether or not we need to adjust those ratios. And if we set a hard number in the BEP, as opposed to tying it to a measure, we're getting ourselves into the same problem that we have already. And that is if you make these hard numbers, not contingent on that which we're after, which is ultimately the benefit to the student, then we wind up having to address this problem again in very few years. And my goal would be to say, let's come up with a way of addressing this that is performance-based, tied to the student progress, student achievement, any number of ways you can phrase that would say, at this point in time for, pick a school district, you know, Lawrence County or wherever, pick one, I don't care. Their performance measures indicate that this particular ratio, and I'm picking on student-teacher ratio because that happens to be one of the ones I looked at in depth. Mm-hmm. This particular ratio needs to change, but it needs to change not on the basis of we think this, that, or the other, but on the basis of performance that is happening right now, not what happened 10 years ago when a study was done or 15 or whatever. But what happened last year?
This totally echoes the conversation we've had here, and but just to think about that, anytime we talk about performance metrics, I definitely want to recommend that we connect those as closely as we can. So, we think about, the third grade performance or eighth grade or ACT or whatever, that if we're looking at those lower grades, so kind of in that example that I was giving, 1 to 15, maybe in the grades K through 3, that we look at those early grades indicators. And I think, sometimes there's a question about the validity or reliability of those measures and metrics at kindergarten or first grade. But I would just encourage, and Danny, just kind of, from our perspective here, that anytime we're going to talk about outcomes in this new funding formula, and as we kind of think about this, that we tie it as directly as possible. If there's going to be like some benefit or some goals that we would have around outcomes in high school, that we look at high school measures specifically that are closest as possible tied to those particular, so cause effect, that if we do this, then we look at this, then when we're looking at the particular metric, that it ties back as closely as possible to the new funding initiative.
I don't disagree with you, but my point is that the measure, whatever measure is appropriate, that it be tied to student performance, and we have an agreement, an operational agreement, meaning that all the people concerned can say, yes, I see validity in this. And now, I might like another measure better than that one, but this one will work, kind of thing. You understand what I'm saying? So from that standpoint, if we just arbitrarily say the ratio in K through 12 is going to be 15, 1 to 15, or in let's say 6 through 8, it's going to be 1 to 20, pick a number. Again, we're sowing the seeds of our own demise in terms of a solution, because all we're doing is tinkering around the edges without having the ability to see what the impact is.
Other thoughts? And Gary, I'm trying to connect your initial question with, and tying it back to there. I think the way I look at bullet 5 now, I'm fully about pulling principals out of bullet 5 on there for me, because to me every school needs a principal. But I think the term flexibility there for local needs, if for instance there is a the way I interpret that is that pot of money for flexibility might address, I'm going to go back to the conversation we had last time we met. There was some discussion, does every building need an SRO? We can debate that yes or no, for our own school systems, but I think one of you said, well, I don't on one of my campuses, because I have an elementary school and a middle school on that same campus. One person could cover both of those campuses. And so therefore, for us to say in a funding model, every student needs access to an SRO, or every building needs an SRO, for instance, that would not be the case. But in another school system, it might be. And I think that was, I think the term we used was going back to that needs assessment of what are those needs. And I think that could also be the same for the conversation there surrounding, outcomes, teacher effectiveness. Does a large urban school maybe need a lower pupil teacher ratio than the rural school districts and things of that nature? So the way I take the bullet 5 is, would there be a pot of money, and let's just say a percentage, if we said that, that a 5% or a 10% on top of the funding formula, that we would get this 5% of, I hate to call it discretionary money because that even sounds worse, but that term that directors of schools, budget, school boards would have that determination to use that. If I decide I need an SRO in every building, if I decide I need a nurse in every building, if I decide that assistant principals on there, I think it's one that I could see that, does every school need an assistant principal? Probably so. Do some need more than one assistant principal? Definitely so. So I think that's the way that I interpret that flexibility on local needs and that pot of money there. Janice, you probably had maybe a little more discussion than I have with that. Is that the way you understand that as well?
Yeah, that's the way I'm hearing that as well. Just the flexibility for you to pull in based on the needs. So I would echo what you've said there. I will go ahead and pull up.
Who makes the decision though? Who makes the decision on what's needed? Because if you dump it to the school board, they're going to say, hey, we need all of that, you know. And as someone pointed out earlier, money is fungible. And so, yeah, well, maybe we really don't need 2 SROs, but we're going to ask for 2, and then we're going to take the money for that second SRO, and we're going to push it over here in this other area we need it. The point is that without tying it to some kind of requirement that is objectively verifiable, we're creating the same problem. So I'll pitch it back. I think your idea is an excellent one. That is to say, it should be needs based. It should be determined by an objective assessment. The question becomes, what is the assessment and who makes it? And at what point do we then say, well, yeah, you have needs, but we're out of our pot of money is empty. And so how are we going to handle that?
Danny, I do want to speak to the issue of the pot of money. I think where we would say from our conversations locally that the base shouldn't be a penny less than what we're getting right now.
Yes, and that has also been stressed throughout everything that I've heard, probably since our second meeting, that is, nothing will be taken away, nothing will be reduced.
Yep.
Thank you and Janice, I know we want to record that, to make sure everyone's on board with that.
Absolutely. I'm pulling over just for a check here. So as we're going, I wanted to, so that we can capture those recommendations and send those over as closely to the end real time of the meeting. Just make sure I've captured your discussion here. Hope it's big enough for you to see.
It is good.
Does that kind of capture what you're saying for the base?
Well, so let's go back to Dr. Lilly's position on SROs and nurses. Again, to represent to Reagan's point, I may not need an SRO in every building, but with that flexible pool, I don't want my money.
Mm-hmm.
We put an SRO in every building before the legislature ever gave us any money to do so.
Gotcha.
I may not need one in every building, but I certainly don't want to be penalized from a local standpoint because our school board made that decision to do so. So to Representative Reagan's point, yes, I may need to take those dollars that the state would give me and use them in a flexible format to reduce class ratios, to put another assistant principal somewhere. And again, I think those are going to be, not at my whim, but certainly needs-based, as you said.
Yeah, and that says there based on needs. Got it.
Jumping back real quickly to one of the things that John said about which I fully support, the base being no less than what we're currently getting. As you all know, some of the comments reference, some of those people commenting had questions, and I'm not 100% sure about our role as far as just making recommendations or trying to relay questions and get those answers, but some of them included questions about sustainability of funding and whether whether additional funding will be available for the foreseeable future. So yeah, I kind of agree with those comments as far as maybe for the next 2, 3, 4 years or whatever, if the base is equivalent to what we're getting now, but at some point, are we worried that the bottom is going to drop out of the funding, and then by some percentage will all revert to a lesser amount? And I don't know that that's something that we answer, but just being true to reviewing the comments, I think some of those things we just need to convey the concern.
And I think right. And Janice, if you can capture that on that document that you were working on, and John also put in the chat box. Let's go back and look at that again. The facilities. That's been something that we have seen as well. That we need to. I think that's a consensus that we all know. There's very little facility money.
Gotcha.
Janice, in my notes, when it asks us to set priorities, we don't actually have to do a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of those. It's just these are high priority for us, and these other things would be lower priorities. So it's not a true 1, 2, 3 ranking. Is that correct?
That's right. And some, I think, have been more literal and done that, but it's certainly, you can just, if there are some that are more prioritized, I can bold those, I can put them over here. I just create a little place if someone, if a group wanted to pull those out to say, hey, these are the ones that are most critical in our opinion, just you have the space to do that.
I didn't see in the school-based support recommendation where we talked about counselors and I know your screens are overlapping for me right there. They are. I didn't see anything in terms of social workers and I hate to call them behaviorists. Is that a good word? Is that a word that we all understand? They don't have to have a particular license, but they need training and behavioral supports for the challenges that we're continuing to see in schools as well.
I agree with that.
So social workers, and again, I use that term broadly. I mean, that could be a family liaison to help provide supports, but some sort of family school liaison support that helps families with parenting skills, that helps social workers help deal with behaviors. Just as we say that, to make sure it's well understood that just does not mean another guidance counselor at the school level.
Gotcha. All right, I captured that here. And we can move on, or I'll give a minute.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, you ready for weights?
Anyone want to stop before we move on? Okay, let's go to weights. And so the first thing that I noticed that is not on this list that we have had that conversation was the difference in rural versus urban. I had an interesting conversation occur in our regional meeting where mayors, finance officers, and others met in terms of regions. So, John Barker, I'm going to put this back to you if you don't mind. If we look at urban districts and if we say there's a higher cost of living in urban districts, and I'm sure it costs more to live in Memphis than it does in Dixon, Tennessee. Does that set us up for, and I know this is a controversial topic as well, but does that set us up to require that an employee live in that urban district in order to be supplemented for that?
Interesting.
If you're gonna, and that conversation was brought to me because I'd mentioned the same thing, because I obviously it does cost more to live in an urban district, but if we're, let's just say if we use this, if we recommend supplementing Shelby County schools because it costs more to live there than it would the outlying suburban and rural areas. But yet you go out and you take the teachers from those rural areas and bring them in, and you're just paying them more simply because they're attracted to a higher salary. Should there be a metric that requires, a residency, something of that nature that requires those dollars actually be spent on those employees that are truly living in that suburban, or I'm sorry, that urban district, as opposed to taking rural educators from a smaller district?
That's an interesting idea, Danny. I would say that there would probably be some costs associated with, so say it's somebody from Fayette County here, so neighboring county to Shelby County, in terms of, cost of wear and tear on the car, the transportation, the kinds of purchases that one would make inside Shelby County. So I would still say that that there is a higher cost of living that would be factored into. So if you're looking at Somerville, Tennessee, out in Fayette County, that teacher would be, that teacher lived here. It lived in Somerville Community Inn. You'd still be incurring some costs that would be associated with that higher cost of living in Shelby County. Does that make sense? Is that?
Yeah, it does. And like I said, it was interesting. I think it was brought to me by one of the mayors, actually.
And of course, those weights are based on, this, we're talking about per student, not really differentiating about employees. And I can imagine employees would, it goes both ways. There's probably teachers that live in Memphis that are working in Fayette, maybe. So
Right.
I kind of may even out there, but I'm not sure how I feel about the weights on that. I know, if yes, it costs more to live in Memphis, but here in the suburbs, we still have MLGW as our utility provider. The gas and bread, probably cost the same amount, and so I'm not sure how that differentiation would work. And I know I'm jumping to things, but on this slide deck, the charter enrollment, can somebody explain to me again, why would charter enrollment, why is that an additional weight?
Hey, that was a question I think this group was wondering last time as well. And I listened for that on, you can check on when the commissioner was speaking with the governor on the 21st, she touched on that we have a subcommittee that this was really bearing out for them, and it was connecting back over to infrastructure needs for public charter schools. So that's where that surfaced through the comments for consideration.
And Gary, I had the opportunity to attend the SCORE event that happened right before the Christmas break as well, and that was one of SCORE's priorities as well, was charter school support. And I'm not saying that we need to recommend that. I'm just saying that's one of the things that appeared a lot, and that appeared in I think several of the public town halls. So we certainly do not have to recommend that at all. We can strike that from our list if that's pleasure of this committee.
Well, I would just like to emphasize that we all have infrastructure needs.
Right.
Well, and some of us have a substantial charter enrollment down here. So we have 57 charter schools in Shelby County. So it's always interesting, when people start talking about and the charter lobby, to be sure. But what's always interesting is for us to consider just what that enrollment difference means. So one of our students who's in a district-run school, because we are a portfolio district, that we have students who are served by district-run schools and students who are served by charter schools. So Gary, to your point, that there is a formula that we use to say that the cost of a student leaving a district-run school to go to a charter school does come with several very interesting departures of revenue streams for us. So that's not an insignificant kind of issue for Shelby County schools at the very least.
Well, going from our 11 o'clock call, one of the things, excuse me, one of the things that was brought up in a couple of calls today has to do with pre-K, and that's going to be there'll be facilities cost, all the costs underlying. If we were to add those pre-Ks, like we talked about earlier, there's added costs, not just the teacher. We don't have space. We may have to rent property off of off-school campuses to have pre-Ks. So I don't think we need to put it on the list necessarily, but I think it's another variable to be taken into account when we look at it, because I know Gary and I were on that same call. Neither one of us have space to add pre-Ks, and we're in growing. Our community continues to grow, we're going to need physical funding for pre-Ks, and we would, just like I'm assuming, or I believe that's why charter enrollment's on there as well.
Representative Reagan has put in our chat box the difference in a rural and the difference in sparsity. And so, Janice, I think we have that definition that you shared with us, but I think we can define that today to answer that question. But I think from a policy standpoint and what would those metrics be to measure those, I think that's something scheduled for meeting 5. Is that correct? So we can go ahead and define that using the definitions we have, but from a policy definition perspective, that's what we'll be doing at meeting 5.
Yes, actually, I think meeting 6.
Okay, 6, I'm sorry.
Yes, right. And so the rural definition is the one we utilize, and it's the federal definition actually has several elements. So we definitely want to review those, and we've kind of flagged that as well. But we operate under a federal definition for rural, just connecting to within how many miles of we fall within from a city, larger center. And then sparsity, I think that conversation is really about, then it could also be rural, but then just the geographic distance and how much time, the impact, I think was for some conversation and consideration was travel time, distance for students who are on buses, just thinking about the large geographic areas and distance to go get students and to support those resources. So.
Representative Reagan, does that help kind of frame that a little bit for you there?
Well, the answer is yes and no. I'm somewhat familiar with the definitions that she mentioned, but the key word that was brought up at the beginning of it, I guess, is to be decided in the future, and that was the metrics. Because to me, that's going to determine the applicability of the definition. And from that standpoint, if we're not there yet, we're not there yet. But the reason I wanted to know if we had a agreed upon definition is I keep going back to operational definitions. I don't care what the dictionary says. I care what we collectively use the term to mean.
Right.
And that's the reason I was asking about agreed upon.
Yeah. We will definitely circle to that. In terms of weighting, I had looked at, as we talk about weighting for special education, for instance, and again, I think when we look at these 4 or 5 student categories here, as we look at those, and again, I don't know that we necessarily need to put a 1, 2, 3, 4 saying these students must be weighted heavier than these others, but I think as we look at those, we ask ourselves, let's take a student with disabilities, for example. As we look at weights, I know right now, I think we operate under 9 or 10 different categories of special education services, all the way from consultation to high cost students. And I think it would also be appropriate for us to think about, there are different levels of service, and as in the BEP, those generate different dollar amounts. Hey, have we come to a place that we'd like to recommend any breakdown of students with disabilities, any weighting for that? I've seen everything from an additional 0.5 all the way to an additional 1.2, I think. So has anyone put thought into that as far as where we are now?
Danny, I haven't, but I've asked our finance department to look into how much it costs above the BEP for us for things like ELL, economically disadvantaged. So I'll hopefully be able to get a comparison to you for that. And, one of the other things we talked about in our leadership group was, you've got kids that are in RTIB that never qualify for special ed, and you would hope we're getting ready to make a transition with our fifth graders, where the current fourth graders are going to stay in their elementary for fifth grade. And you would hope that as they age, you have fewer children being served through RTI.
Mhm.
Sometimes you get those children who stay in because if you remove the support, they're not going to be successful. So that also costs money as far as our RTI students are concerned. And I think that is something that's probably, it's measurable. You can identify those kids. Those things we have, if we look at it, and we can tell you who they are by name, actually. When I get that, Janice, I'll shoot it to you.
And I think
just our system.
Yeah, and at one of our early meetings, I think we talked about, that emphasis on those students who were not, not meeting our expectations, not reading on grade level, for instance, at third grade, and having the ability to intervene early and to work with those, be it through an RTI program or, who, Steve, you mentioned they're not in special education programs. So I don't see that mentioned anywhere unless that's this tier based. Maybe that's what that parentheses is meant.
I think that's what that means, the tier based.
Okay. I don't see any mention anywhere in here. Homeless students. And I know some of particularly our urban areas have, populations of homeless students. And again, there's a federal definition of that, is that something we want to include?
I do, but I'm trying to look at what it would be like, I'm trying not to just localize it to my district when I
Right.
look at this, but we definitely have, we have a large portion of our students that are considered homeless. We serve them. We receive some funding through McKinney-Vento, but obviously we kick in more. It's just like another mandate, and we're a service center, so it costs more to do business in a community where most of your English language learners are going to come. Most of your homeless students are served. Those things they add up, and the major cost is the employees you have to hire to provide and oversee those services.
Right.
We'd echo those sentiments down here too.
And then one other category of students I'm not seeing mentioned in here of waiting was our high school students who are, and maybe even middle school students who are in CTE. And I know that's been a priority of our governor, at least. Did we include that back in base, Janice, or is that going to be considered a wait? I guess it would be a wait because those students are actually, those programs, CTE programs, often require additional funding. So that would be more of a wait than it would be a base, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think we can also see it when you move into some of the direct support.
Okay.
Those fixed costs they may show up there as well. Pull over what I've captured so far. So for weights, considering thinking about an urban weighted value there, urban and rural, and we had a little discussion around the difference in coming back to that definition. Definitely that will be moving forward. We'll have some definitions that bear out, and we can weigh in on that before our 6th meeting. And then you mentioned some weighted tiers. We'll get more information from you all there on what that might look like and have consideration there as well.
Great. And then if we look in the chat, Representative Reagan has asked, special education students, is there a disproportionate amount, I guess, is the question, from rural to urban districts.
Mhm.
Some superintendent want to address that? Steve, you? No.
Just from the difference, it's one of those areas between Johnson City and Washington County where we're in Carter and Sullivan also, but mainly Washington County. That's one area we are very similar, is our special ed population numbers. And our overall population is pretty close too.
Hey, I see John's put that comment nationally. It's about 14%. I think typically 14, 17, 18% is pretty normal across our state, regardless of district, I assume. I've never worked in an urban district. John, you say that's pretty consistent with Shelby. Okay. Okay, Janice, we got about 5 minutes. Push us along. Direct funding. This would be where and I go back to, maybe this is that pot of money that would come, or, you know, whether it's a percentage, if we all received, you know, X number of dollars, this would be X plus 3% or X plus 5% or X plus 7% to do with as districts needed. So if we're a faster growing county or a faster growing school district, developing CTE programs, using innovative models, STEAM technology, tutoring. Thoughts or ideas there?
Danny, we're kind of excited about the prospect of some additional supports. So to Representative Reagan's concerns about class size issue, that additional supports at K1, 2, 3. What the state has done is said, hey, third grade is our really, really important time. That third grade commitment is what we call it here. But by third grade, we really want to have made an impact on students' lives. So probably the thought about actually having additional supports for those youngest students, so assistants, education assistants. We've actually used some ESSER dollars to do that with us, with our students here. But yeah, so that would, kind of, if you think about additional funding to be of support in those youngest students' classrooms, I think probably Gary and Steve might say that pre-K would probably qualify for that too.
Absolutely, yeah. Would this be the spot that we would also consider like sustained funding for summer programming?
I think it's a good place to make sure it's included.
Danny, I have a question.
Sure.
I know in the base we've got middle school CTE, and then we got it here in additional dollars. Am I correct on that? Oh, that was just in the varied local needs. Okay.
It was in that flexibility piece.
That flexibility that we talked about. Okay.
Gary, can I go back and add, when you mentioned summer programming, that we put all costs associated with that? Because I know there was a lot of discussion in the legislature last year before summer programming was finalized. There was still the question of whether transportation or not was going to be included in that. So I know Russell and I were at summer study committees when both committees, we talked about the need for transportation as a part of summer programming. So when we say summer program, it's just not the teachers, it's the other costs that go along with that. I think we had to hire some secretarial support, some transportation costs, some nurses and things like that to manage a true summer program. It wasn't just a come and go, and it wasn't just the cost of the teachers at some given ratio again.
Danny, I think that is an excellent point. The transportation in particular made all the difference in our summer programming and the success. So yes, please.
Okay. I've seen in the chat Representative Reagan and Steve Barnett have other meetings scheduled. So gentlemen, thank you for your time today. We'll be wrapping up here in another couple minutes, but thank you for your input. We will see you at our next meeting again. Thank you for that. I don't want to rush through these slides just faster. Is there anything else that we want to see that you've seen included in the local funding additional dollars program?
Yeah, so what I captured so far, oops. Additional supports in the K-3, including assistance, pre-K. Not sure if there's anything else mentioned there. Sustained funding for summer programming to include all associated costs, transportation, personnel.
Do we have anything in here where we talked about transportation as far as, right now they only fund you if you're on the bus for a mile or more? We have a lot of students that are on a bus less than that. I know we talked about that at one time. Do we have that? I can't remember if we have it. Would that fit here, or is that?
Mm-hmm. It could. It can. Yeah, it definitely could. Looking at, I don't see it specifically mentioned here in the base, but it certainly can. Transportation.
Yeah.
Is there a specific funding notation per mile that you were wanting to know?
I think if they're on the bus, they should be included no matter how long they're on the bus.
Yeah. Gotcha.
And then let's hop down to the last one, is our outcomes.
Yes.
So these were some things that have been mentioned again. And again, I've heard the commissioner mention that this is not supposed to be a reward for those, a reward for performance or reward for test scores, but it's more of there are additional costs associated with students who are doing these things and participating in these things, as I understand that. So as more students participate in EPSOs, there needs to be additional funding to be added to that. Is that the way I understand that correctly? As more students participate in AP classes, as more students earn industry certifications, there are additional dollars that need to go to those districts to offset those costs. It's not a reward for doing those. It is costs associated with students in these programs and performing in these.
What additional consideration in this category could potentially be like JROTC programs as well? There are additional costs for those programs.
I thought the same thing about athletics.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we emphasize the importance of those programs, and I shouldn't say athletics, co-curricular programs.
Yeah.
So co-curricular and or athletic programs. And so, as we place students into these, there's certainly costs associated with those things and with students participating in these events that, certainly as they complete, as they do these things, as they participate in those, the cost of the equipment for those programs, band programs, choir programs, ROTC, you mentioned, Gary.
Robotics. I mean, you're right. The more opportunities you provide, the more costs are associated.
Mm-hmm. The differentiated compensation support came up in a couple of conversations. I know this committee is not about our so much about our personal opinions, but is that something that we want to include in there? I don't know how many of your districts are providing differentiated compensation, but
And Danny, say just a little bit more about, I mean, because I know we've done a differentiated comp, but like hard to serve and hard to staff areas kinds of stuff.
I'd say yes, but I also wonder if that doesn't
Tim bonuses too.
pay for performance. I wonder if that's not, I think when I know there are districts who do pay for performance. If you're a level 5, you get X dollars, or you move X steps on the pay grade.
Yeah, that it costs more to have good teachers or effective teachers. It's like interesting. I would say that, just from absolutely, and literacy is life, and that's what we say, and our superintendent has that as a motto. One of the things that just definitely, I mean, if we're starting to talk about outcomes, I think STEM outcomes have to be in there. I think there's, yes, reading, yes, literacy, absolutely, and positively, though, we have to, I mean, given where we are, and obviously, CCTE and all the kinds of things that we've talked about previously, but, it will make me feel uncomfortable if we don't necessarily call out STEM in the same kind of way that we called out reading and literacy.
Gotcha. And Janice, the people who will read this, I mean, obviously without us going through every definition of an episode, I mean, the people that get our report will all understand that's all inclusive, correct? I mean, we don't need to start listing those out.
Right. I've tried to list a few, everything that you've said, I've tried to capture that. Yeah, and to your point, this slide is, the associated costs, and how also thinking about that incentivization, might we consider like completers, is if we're thinking about that matriculation for post-secondary, if there's an area that we would like to, as a state, to see an increase in student completion that leads them to a certification or a next step for, a career in college readiness. If there's something that stands out there, that might be worth thinking through. And that's a good question to get a little more clarification on the outcomes and how to think through that. Because I agree, as you said earlier, it's not really just that achievement, like a reward. That's not the intent. It's kind of getting behind to support incentivizing, but that attainment of a big priority. And certainly reading is a big priority, but what multiple measures would be appropriate for that? I think that's where we really still are needing feedback and value those. So
yeah, Janice, to me, I think the one that I maybe had sent in somewhere in the comments or wherever was Fafsa Completion. Yeah. So, Fafsa Completion unlocks the door to so many different kinds of things. And, is that something we would want to incentivize? Because clearly that's a great thing. And clearly it opens doors down the line. Is that something that you tie funding to?
Yeah, I just added that. Thank you. Perfect. So as you think about anything else there and kind of wrap our minds around how we might incentivize those specific outcomes we're trying to move toward that set students up for success, we can certainly come back to those. And as you think of those and solicit feedback from your teams, feel free to send those directly to tnedu.funding and tag me, and I will also put that over straight to the commissioner. I know she's being very responsive. They are pulling her feedback for us to have that structured draft structure for us to be able to look at to put this together and then have feedback on that, of course. So no dollars in that at all, but just pulling what you're prioritizing here so that we can start to see it in that structure and you can make the decisions. I think that will help where you're asking, is it still here, or where it might also be in both places. So, yeah.
Right. And so, Janice, I guess that'll carry us down to our last slide then. You just want to jump down to our last one, our next meeting times, next meeting dates.
That's right. Same time, same place, and the 20th.
On the 20th. So thank you guys. I think we've accomplished quite a bit today. So we'll we'll get that down. And I know Janice, thank you for taking notes and putting those in there, and you'll be sharing those with our committee, and then we'll review those, make any comments that you see need to be changed before those get sent on to the next group, right?
That's right. And I don't want to make you sick scrolling up through here, but I will put this over to you just here in a minute and let you weigh in so we can get this back over as close to real time as possible. Yeah.
Well, hope you all enjoy your day and enjoy the rest of it. And if you're receiving snow like we are here in Middle Tennessee, it is about 5 inches outside my door right now. So we've quite a bit here in Dixon. So enjoy, be safe. Thank you for your work, and look forward to seeing you guys in a couple of weeks.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank y'all.
Bye.